Welcome to Urban Connections, a show about the urban environment and its impacts on people's physical and mental health. I'm Ucheo Seneme.
And I'm Alexis Thorderson.
And we're going to be your hosts this week. On today's show, we will be interviewing Dr. Marielle Papin, who has looked at how cities seek to improve the well-being of their citizens through urban wellness initiatives.
The question of migration, the question of just urbanization, urban sprawl. What do we do about this? How do we protect ourselves? How do we prepare for natural disasters? How do we become more resilient? How do we become greener? My name is Dr. Marielle Papin. I am assistant professor in political science, Canada Research Chair in urban wellness, and director of the Research Institute for Urban Wellness here at MacEwan University. I teach about political science, specifically public policy, environmental policy and politics, which is my favorite, and different courses related to urban wellness. I do a lot of research because of my position as Canada Research Chair. My research is mostly about transnational city networks or transnational municipal networks engaged in climate governance. And what that means is that I'm interested in how these networks of cities tend to steer cities towards climate policy and help them enhance their climate policies at the local level.
Urban wellness and environmental sustainability join to create urban settings that are more than merely livable for people. They produce long-lasting infrastructure that supports people's well-being while considering climate initiatives. Things such as urban forestry, green spaces, and community gardens become a hub for connection and ecological prosperity. In other words, when urban wellness and environmental sustainability come together, they create space for connection, which supports people's mental and physical health. When people hear the term urban wellness, they think of urbanization, and when I think of urbanization, I picture buildings and physical infrastructure that can support more people. So it is important to have a discussion about urban wellness and how it relates to climate initiatives and green spaces that enable people to connect with nature in their urban environments.
So we were wondering if you could explain what urban wellness means to you and how this topic has impacted you personally.
Mm-hmm. So from the research institute that I lead, we don't have a specific definition of urban wellness. And I think that anyone, when they hear the idea, the concept of urban wellness, they have a certain understanding of it. Like you understand the idea of urban, you understand the idea of wellness, so you make your own understanding of urban wellness. And that's perfectly fine. We do not want to impose our definition. The way I see it is about ways to enhance the well-being of people living in cities. And there are two aspects that are important in that. One of them is enhancing the well-being of all residents of cities. In an urban wellness framing, we focus a lot on the idea of social justice. It's not about the well-being of a few privileged, but of many people. So this aspect is important. And I think when we talk about well-being in general, there are things that we have lost in cities and that I think we need to focus on when we talk about urban wellness. And by that, I mean different types of connections, but more specifically connections to nature, to the land, and connections to communities, to people. We talk a lot about when you live in a city, you can feel a lot of social isolation. This is something that is quite prominent in cities. And so recreating that link to people, recreating that link to communities, in modern cities at least, that link has not disappeared, but has really faded away a little bit. So those, I think, are very important points when we talk about urban wellness.
I think that's a really interesting response. Like when I first heard the term urban wellness, I thought urbanization. But when you talk about connection with nature, people just forget how important that is, especially in a city.
When I first heard the idea of urban wellness, I thought we were talking about like a spa in the middle of the city. And there's something to it, like connections to self is also something that is important. Myself, I'm mostly interested in those connections to communities and those connections to land and nature, but there are other types of connections that might be important to different people, to different communities.
So you mentioned transnational municipal networks. What do you think that they can offer the City of Edmonton?
So when you think of transnational municipal networks or transnational city networks, you got to think about how cities work at the global level. And it's not really how we see cities. Cities are local actors, local settings, and seeing them as acting at the global level is sometimes surprising to people because that's usually how we think of states. But there are more and more cities that want to be active at the global level. They want to engage with cities from other countries so that they can learn from those cities, for example. They also want to have some space at the international level, like the UN. They want to talk about the issues that they are experiencing because of climate change, because of international migration, different sorts of issues. When you think about it this way, you think, oh yeah, definitely, I can see like some cities doing that. But usually you think like New York, Washington, D.C., London, Paris, you think Tokyo, you think really global cities. So what does it mean for Edmonton? Edmonton is a pretty big city in Canada. I remember hearing it was the biggest small city in Canada or something like that. We wouldn't necessarily think of it as a global city, but actually Edmonton is part of several of those transnational city networks, because transnational city networks are not just about global cities. They're about cities trying to connect with other cities around the world to better understand how those cities are doing certain things. There's so many cities in the world, obviously, way more than there are countries, but they go through similar issues. The question of migration, again, comes up. The question of just urbanization, urban sprawl. What do we do about this? How do we protect ourselves? How do we prepare for natural disasters? How do we become more resilient? How do we become greener? How do we make sure that we protect our local cultures in intense wave of globalization? So they go through, to a certain extent, similar issues. And so the smaller cities might want to connect to other cities in the world that go through the same things.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Leading with that, what do you think the future of transnational municipal networks, what do you think the future of that looks like?
So in terms of urban wellness, these networks tackle a variety of issues. In many cases, they talk about environmental issues. That's something that's very relevant to Edmonton. We tend to see more hot days in Edmonton. There used to be, I think it was in the 1960s, on average, one day above 30 degrees Celsius in the summer. I don't know if you counted how many hot days there were this summer. Way more, right? So it's a trend. So this question of the heat in cities is important and is discussed. So environmental issues are a big part of what networks are talking about in terms of urban wellness. But for Edmonton, that might be about, going back to the question of migration, it can be internal migration too. Like, how do we deal with so many people coming to Edmonton because it's a more affordable city? People coming from different parts of Canada, but also from different countries, right? So how do we deal with that is also a question that they might address. So in the future of transnational city networks, I see a lot of space for environmental and climate issues, but I also see more room for social justice and linking the two, linking the environment with social justice. It's about talking more about environmental migrants and what we do, because they arrive from countries where situations have become too hard. So they leave those spaces and they get to cities. That's the first place they get to. So that's one big aspect of it. But also recognizing that we need to, when we address environmental issues, we need to deal with social issues as well. So we need to consider how different minorities are affected by climate change, and how different minorities can contribute to climate policy. So I think there's a lot more convergence of issues in those networks. Maybe there used to be more networks focusing on one issue, and now every network does a little bit of everything, because they're really seeing all the crises that cities go through in a systemic way. They're all interrelated. Like, we can talk about migration and the environment at the same time, right?
We were wondering if you could kind of explain to us, in your own words, how urban wellness and climate initiatives are connected. If you've got an example from your personal life that you found the connection of these two was very beneficial.
The way urban wellness has impacted my work is that I used to just work on transnational city networks and climate initiatives and all this with a really climate policy focus. And by introducing this urban wellness aspect and about how we need to think about addressing the well-being of people now for the future, but it's also about now, that really made me think of climate policy in a more, you might say, humane way. How it's about the people and how it's about improving their well-being for the future. That's often how we think of climate issues. It's about those disasters that are going to accumulate. But urban wellness is also and foremost about the now. How do we improve our well-being right now? And so I think that they kind of feed each other a little bit. How do our climate policies right now affect our well-being right now? And how do we make sure that by addressing climate concern for the future, we also consider how the way we see our policies right now will affect our well-being? In other words, how do we make sure that we build climate policies that improve our well-being for the future, but do not negatively affect it right now, right? So for example, I've been doing this community-based project at the Green and Gold Garden at the U of A Urban Farm. And it's a place and it's a community. It's people volunteering every week to grow vegetables together. They sell those vegetables, and all the money that they get is not for them because they're volunteers. They send to an association in Rwanda. What I really like about this is that, yes, there is the international connection. That's really nice. People that feel that they do that for a purpose. And that's really important for your well-being. Like, what is your purpose in the society? So there's that. But it's also, most of them, I feel, go to the garden every week because they're doing this activity that they enjoy, that really helps with, their physical health. It's a physical activity to a certain degree. And mental health also because you are doing that with other people and those people become your friends. So you create those connections to the land and to community at the same time. Maybe some people don't necessarily do it for Rwanda. Maybe they do it for themselves. But it's doing so many things at the same time. And just an example of how there are some pockets of urban wellness activities that are beneficial both to the environment, but they're also just good for themselves, for people that are involved in those activities. And there's no policy focus there. It's not the government telling those people what they should do or like implementing this. It's really just people that found a land that they could use. They found that space and they made it a place. They filled it with people. They filled it with a purpose, with intentions, and that really built into something that's making a lot of people feel really good.
That's really cool. That's something I would even be interested in doing. I've never really gardened.
Yeah. So one of the great things about this community is that it's very inclusive, and you don't have any gardening background, it's okay. You'll learn. Yeah. And the learning is a big part of it. And I think learning is also a big part of urban wellness. The will to learn things is really something that also gives us purpose. And so that really helps.
So this will be our last question. This is my favorite question. What do you see as the largest urban wellness issue here in Edmonton?
I'm going to answer not with my own answer, but with what students of my Urban Crisis and Wellness course answered last semester. So I had this course called Urban Crisis and Wellness in the winter, and students had to write essays about an urban crisis and the solution, the policy intervention they would design to solve this crisis. And so many students focused on the question of houselessness. And related to this, they talked about drug addiction. They talked just about the housing crisis in general. And I think it's really telling about one of the issues that really matters, and it matters in Edmonton, it matters in all of the cities of Canada, is houselessness and the different issues that are connected to that. And how we solve this, it's incredibly complex. This is definitely one of the biggest challenges that we are experiencing.
Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
So when I do my research on transnational city networks, I feel more on the networks as institutions than on individual cities. But cities obviously need to keep in mind, and those networks too need to keep in mind, that not every solution will work in the local context, right? So it is challenging to go from what works in a city on the other side of the world to what might work in Edmonton. Once you open yourself to these networks and all the solutions that they offer, it's challenging to think about, yes, but will this work for Edmonton, for example? And so when we think of those other examples of urban wellness elsewhere, even in Montreal, this idea of, we're going to make streets for pedestrians and we're going to close them to cars is nice, but is it really going to improve urban wellness for Edmonton? It's always this background question. You could see that this looks really nice, but is it what works for our city and for our community of urban residents, right? I think it's challenging, and it is an important aspect of my research, I guess. I look at what cities do collectively, transnationally. How does it relate to what they can, should, or are doing locally? Is part of my work, but it's challenging.
Fair. I guess one more thing I was kind of just wondering is, what is your opinion on the concept of a 15-minute city? And do you think that the implementation of more of these would be beneficial to urban wellness in the long run?
Yeah, definitely. I think we've kind of lost touch of what a city should be like. We just have it, we know what they are right now, but there are ways to make them better and make them better for us. I am convinced that everybody would be better off if they didn't have to spend an hour in their car every day. And that's kind of the idea of the 15-minute city. Of course, I understand that there are controversial interpretations of the 15-minute city. I don't think they are justified, though. So thinking that it's a way for the government to control your movement, I don't think was never really the aim and will never be. So I think there are many more benefits to the 15-minute city than drawbacks. But you have to consider the idea that 15-minute cities, they need to be inclusive. It's not just about making everybody walk, right? Because some people cannot. Because even if you're not disabled, you might have 3 children under the age of 4 and you cannot walk that much for that long, right? It's about making cities that work for different people, urban wellness, but that overall help us live better lives by just making things closer to us so that we don't have to rely on our car all the time. That will improve our well-being. That will also improve, obviously, our environment, our quality. So yeah, I'm all in favor.
Awesome. Glad to hear that. Okay, I think we've come to the end of our time together.
Cool. Thank you. That was interesting.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us at Urban Connections. This week's episode was produced by Evan Regan, Uche Osineme, Alexis Thorderson, Marielle Chiplack, and Hayden Latimer. The show was edited by Evan Regan, Uche Osineme, Alexis Thorderson, Marielle Chiplack, and Hayden Latimer. The show's supervising producer is Sheena Rossiter. Additional studio supervision was Sasha Stanoivich. This episode was produced as part of the BCSE 302 online content production course in the fall 2024 semester. The course is part of the Bachelor of Communication Studies program in the Department of Communications at MacEwan University. This show is a collaboration between the Department of Communications and the Research Institute for Urban Wellness at MacEwan University. The show was edited and produced out of the MacEwan Media Production Studio. Our theme music is called Creativity by Kaylee Lambert. Other music is by Zakar Valaha from Pixabay, and the bird sounds are by Empress Catherine Nefertiti Mumbai from Pixabay. Logo design for this podcast is by Sasha Stanoivich, and I'm Alexis Thorderson.
And I'm Uche Osineme.
And we were your hosts for this week's episode. This podcast was recorded on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional and ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis settlements and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 9, 10, and 11 within the historical North Saskatchewan River Territory. Don't forget to subscribe to Urban Connections on your podcast app. And please leave us a review and rating. It really helps people find the show. Please join us again next time when we explore more urban connections.